She arrived on a Thursday, which is the kind of detail that should not matter, and somehow always does. She had a single satchel, a pair of boots that had been resoled once already, and $11.40, which was what remained after the bank had taken the farm, the equipment, the mule, and most of what she had believed her life to be. The town of Harrow Creek watched her climb down from the wagon with the particular attention that small places reserve for people who have already been decided about. She did not look up. She had learned by then that looking up only invited more of what she was trying to endure. Her name was Willa Crane, and she was 34 years old, and she had done nothing wrong. That was the part that stayed with her through the long autumn nights in that narrow room at Mrs. Alcott's boarding house. Not the grief of losing the farm, not even the grief of losing her husband, but the quiet, unbearable fact that she had done nothing wrong, and the world had arranged itself as though she had. Some losses arrive like weather. They do not ask. They simply come, and they take what they take, and they leave you standing in what remains. There is a particular kind of woman the frontier produces and does not praise. She does not weep in public. She does not ask for more than she is offered. She wakes before the cold has left the walls, and she works until the light is gone, and she does not mistake endurance for happiness, but she does not give up on happiness either. She holds it the way you hold a coal through the winter, carefully, without squeezing, aware that pressure is what puts a thing out. Willa Crane was that kind of woman. Harrow Creek did not know what to do with her. He came into town on the same Thursday, though neither of them knew that yet. His name was Daniel Holt, and he carried his hat in his hand when he stepped indoors, and he did not speak unless he had something to say, which meant he was often quiet in a way the town mistook for coldness. He was not cold. He was simply a man who had learned that words, like tools, ought to be used for the work they were meant for and not left running when the job was done. He had a lease on land north of town and a fence line that needed mending before the first hard frost, and he needed a room for a few weeks, and that was all he had come for. That was what he told himself. What happened between them was not the kind of story that announces itself. It did not arrive with flourish or declaration. It arrived the way a good fire arrives in a cold room, slowly, from the edges, warming the air before it warms the people in it. And by the time Harrow Creek understood what it was witnessing, the thing was already done, and the two of them were already home. The wagon set her down at the edge of Harrow Creek on a Thursday morning in the third week of October, and the town did not come out to meet her. A dog lifted its head from the steps of the dry goods store and then put it back down. A woman in a gray shawl paused on the opposite side of the street, looked once, and continued walking. The driver handed down her satchel without a word, clicked at his horses, and was gone before the dust had finished settling around her boots. Willa Crane stood where he had left her and did not move for a moment, not because she was lost, but because she was deciding. She had done this before, the standing, the deciding. She had stood in the yard of the farm in Calhoun County on the morning the bank's man came with his papers, and she had decided not to cry in front of him. She had stood at her husband Roy's grave in August, with the preacher's words going past her like water over stone, and she had decided to wait until she was home to feel it properly. She had stood in her sister's kitchen in September, listening to the offer that was not quite an offer, the suggestion that she might stay and help with the children in exchange for a room. And she had decided that she would rather be cold and free than warm and owed. She was good at standing and deciding. It was one of the few things the past year had not taken from her. Harrow Creek was a settlement of perhaps 300 souls, positioned in a narrow valley between two ridge lines that turned purple in the late afternoon light. It had a main street of packed dirt, a livery, a dry goods store run by a man named Colbert, a church that was also used for town meetings, a saloon that was quieter than most, and a boarding house operated by Mrs. Alcott at the far end of the street. There was a mill 2 miles north along the creek and a blacksmith who also pulled teeth. It was not a prosperous town. It was the kind of town that had survived several things and bore the look of it: buildings repaired with wood that did not quite match, a water trough that leaned slightly east, a general air of things being managed rather than enjoyed. Willa had chosen it because Roy's cousin had written to say that Mrs. Alcott sometimes took in boarders who were willing to help with the washing and the cooking in exchange for a reduced rate. The letter had been 3 months old by the time it reached her, and she had written back. And Mrs. Alcott had replied in a hand that was precise and not particularly warm, confirming that there was a room available and that the arrangement could be discussed upon arrival. Willa had taken this as good enough. Good enough was the measure she was using for most things that autumn. Mrs. Alcott was a woman of perhaps 60, thin in the way that some women become thin when they have worked hard for many years and not eaten as much as the work required. She received Willa at the door with a look that covered her from boots to collar and came to some conclusion that she did not share. The room, she said, was at the top of the stairs, the second door on the left. Supper was at 6. Washing was done on Mondays. If Willa intended to take her meals with the other boarders, she was expected to help clear and wash up after. There were currently 3 other boarders, 2 men who worked at the mill and a school teacher from Ohio who kept to herself. Mrs. Alcott said all of this without pausing, as though she had said it many times and saw no reason to make it conversational. The room was small. That was the first thing. The window looked out onto the back lot where the wood pile was stacked, and beyond it a stand of cottonwoods that had mostly given up their leaves. There was a bed with an iron frame, a washstand, a peg on the wall for coats, and a small chest of drawers with a crack along the top that had been filled with something dark and hardened. The ceiling sloped on one side. In the corner, where the slope met the wall, there was not enough room to stand upright. Willa set her satchel on the bed and looked at the room for a long moment, and then she unpacked her things and put them in the drawers, and hung her second dress on the peg, and set her worn Bible on the washstand, and told herself that she had slept in worse and that this was a beginning and not an ending. She had $11.40. She counted it that evening by the light of the small lamp, sitting on the edge of the bed with her boots still on because the floor was cold through her stockings. She had what she was owed for the last of Roy's cattle, which had sold badly, and what she had saved from the small work she had done in the months since: mending, a week of helping a neighbor with a new baby, 2 days of washing for a woman who had sprained her wrist. $11.40 was not nothing. It was also not enough to be careless with, and she knew it. And she put it back in the cloth pouch she kept pinned inside her dress, and blew out the lamp and lay in the dark, listening to the creek she could not see but could hear faintly through the wall. The next morning she went to the dry goods store to ask about work, and Colbert, the owner, was not unkind, but he had nothing. She tried the milliner 2 doors down, who said she might have something in the spring. She stopped at the church and spoke to the preacher's wife, who said she would ask around, in the tone of a woman who would not ask around. By noon she had walked the length of the main street twice, and learned that Harrow Creek was a town that did not have much room for one more person trying to get by. She bought a small piece of salt pork and a heel of bread from Colbert and ate it sitting on the edge of the water trough, which was cold through her skirt, and watched the street and thought. It was Mrs. Alcott who told her, without exactly meaning to be helpful, that there might be laundry work available from some of the households up the East Road, women whose husbands worked long hours and who had more washing than time. Willa thanked her and walked the East Road that same afternoon and knocked on 4 doors and came away with a commitment from 2 of them, enough to cover her reduced board for the week, not enough to put anything away. She walked back to the boarding house as the light went flat and gray, and the cold came down from the ridges with the particular authority it has in October in a valley. and she thought about the $11.40. And she thought about spring, and she thought about the fact that she was here and still standing, and that this was, for the moment, what she had to work with. At supper that evening, she sat at the end of the table nearest the kitchen door and did not speak much, and the two mill workers talked about a fence line up north that someone was paying to have repaired before the passes closed, and the school teacher from Ohio read a small book propped against her water glass, and Mrs. Alcott moved between the kitchen and the table without sitting down herself. The food was plain, and there was enough of it, and Willa ate slowly and listened to the sounds of the town settling into evening. A horse at the livery, a door somewhere. The creek beneath everything like a low and patient word. She did not know yet what this place would give her or take from her. She only knew she was in it now, and that Thursday had become Friday, and that she was still here. He arrived on a Friday evening, which was the day after Willa did, though neither of them marked the coincidence at the time. Mrs. Alcott showed him to the room at the far end of the upstairs hall, the largest of the four, which she reserved for boarders who stayed longer than a week and paid without being reminded. He came with a bedroll strapped to a pack, a pair of saddlebags, and a hat he removed when he stepped through the front door with the automatic courtesy of a man who had been taught young and had not forgotten. He told Mrs. Alcott his name was Daniel Holt, that he had a lease on pasture land north of town, that he needed a room for perhaps 3 weeks while he repaired the fence line before the passes closed for winter. Mrs. Alcott told him supper was at 6 and showed him the way upstairs, and that was the whole of their introduction. He came down to supper that first evening, after everyone else was already seated, not late but last, and he took the chair at the far end of the table without being directed to it, as though he had assessed the arrangement in a single glance and chosen the position that required the least adjustment from everyone else. He said good evening to the table at large and meant it and did not say much else. He ate without complaint and without particular haste. When the schoolteacher from Ohio knocked her water glass and caught it before it fell, he steadied the pitcher nearest him without looking up, just moved his hand to where it needed to be. Willa noticed this. She noticed it the way you notice something that does not ask to be noticed, quietly, and then it is already done. In the days that followed, he established a pattern that did not vary much. He was gone before first light, up to the lease land with his horse and his tools. And he came back in the early evening with the particular quiet of a man who has worked hard in the cold and has not wasted any of it on words. He washed up at the pump in the back lot before coming inside. He hung his coat on the peg by the back door and not on the hook in the hall, which left the hall hook free for whoever needed it, which turned out most mornings to be Willa. She did not think he had arranged this deliberately. She thought he simply saw what was in front of him and made room. He fixed the back step on a Tuesday. It had been soft for some time, the second board giving slightly underfoot, and Mrs. Alcott had mentioned it at supper in the manner of someone who has mentioned something several times and does not expect it to change. The following morning, Willa came down early to start the washing water and found the step already replaced, the new board still pale against the weathered ones around it, and a small, neat pile of the old, rotten wood stacked beside the wood pile. She did not see him do it. She only saw what he had done, which was its own kind of statement. The rusted latch on the cellar door was mended by Wednesday. A bucket in the kitchen that had leaked along its seam, slowly, onto the shelf beneath it, warping the wood, was patched and back in its place by Thursday. He did not mention any of it. Willa watched this without watching it, which is to say, she was aware of it the way you are aware of weather. Not staring at it, but knowing it is there and that it has implications. She had known men who fixed things for display, who wanted to be seen fixing and thanked for fixing and credited with fixing at supper. Daniel Holt did not appear to want any of that. He fixed things because they needed fixing, and because he was the kind of man who did not walk past a thing that needed doing. She understood this type because she was herself this type. and she had learned that people who share a nature do not always recognize each other quickly, but they do eventually, the way a room eventually warms when there is a good fire in it, not all at once, but steadily and from the edges in. They spoke for the first time beyond pleasantries on a Wednesday evening, the second week of his stay, when the wind came down hard from the north, and everyone at supper was quieter than usual in the way that hard weather makes people quiet. The mill workers had gone up to bed early. The schoolteacher had her book. Mrs. Alcott was in the kitchen. Willa was mending a pillowcase at the table by the lamp, and Daniel was at the far end with a piece of paper he was marking figures on. Fence lengths, she supposed, or costs, though she did not look closely. He said, without preamble, that the wind sounded like it had some ice in it. She said she thought so too. He said the passes might go earlier than people were hoping. She said that the women up the East Road had been saying the same thing, that their husbands were working longer days to get things finished before it came. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. He said he expected he would be finished with the fence line by the end of the following week if the ground held. She said that was good. He said yes, and that was the whole of it, and it was somehow sufficient. And neither of them felt the need to add to it. The town, in the meantime, had not updated its opinion of Willa. Colbert at the dry goods store was civil in the way that costs nothing and gives nothing. The milliner had not come back with any news about spring work. Mrs. Greaves, who lived in the largest house on the west side of the main street and whose opinion the town seemed to treat as a kind of unofficial record, had said something to Mrs. Alcott. Willa had not heard it directly, only heard Mrs. Alcott's response, which was a short sound that might have been agreement. And whatever had been said had to do with Willa and Roy's debts and the farm in Calhoun County, and what it said about a woman's judgment, as though a woman's judgment were responsible for a drought and a bank's patience running out. Willa did not respond to this because she had not been meant to hear it, and because there was nothing to say to it that would not cost her more than the saying was worth. But she felt it. She felt it the way you feel a room's temperature. Not dramatically, not with visible shivering, but as a constant fact of the environment that requires ongoing management. She kept her chin level when she walked through town. She did her work on the East Road without complaint and without asking for more than was agreed. She ate her suppers at Mrs. Alcott's table and did not look for sympathy, and did not perform cheerfulness either. She was simply present and honest and doing what was needed, and she held on to the knowledge that this was enough, even when the $11.40 in the cloth pouch felt lighter than it had. Daniel Holt did not look at her the way the town looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to place, carefully, without conclusion, with the patience of someone who knows that first impressions are only the beginning of a thing and not the whole of it. He did not ask her questions she had not invited. He did not offer her sympathy she had not requested. He passed the bread when it was near him, and she needed it. And he steadied things when they were in danger of falling, and he did not make a production of either, and in a season when almost everything had required something from her that she had not been sure she had left to give, this particular quality of his, the not asking, the not requiring, was something she felt in the back of her chest, like warmth coming through a wall from a fire on the other side. Mrs. Greaves came into Colbert's dry goods store on a Tuesday morning in the first week of November, and she did not lower her voice when she spoke, which was itself a kind of announcement. She said that it was a peculiar thing, a woman in Willa Crane's situation, making herself comfortable at Mrs. Alcott's table, as though she had not left a string of debts behind her in Calhoun County. She said that Roy Crane's failings were one thing, but that a woman who had kept house for a failing man without raising a word of alarm was either blind or complicit, and she was not sure which was worse. Colbert said nothing useful in response, which was his habit, and Mrs. Greaves bought her lamp oil and her molasses and left, and the words stayed in the store the way smells stay, long after the source is gone. Willa was not there when it happened. She heard it from Percy, who was 9 years old, and ran errands for Mrs. Alcott and for half the households on the main street, and who had the particular gift of very young people for repeating exactly what they had heard without understanding why they should not. He told her on the back steps on a Tuesday afternoon, matter-of-factly, the way he reported most things, while she was bringing in the dry washing from the line. He said Mrs. Greaves had been talking about her at Colbert's. He said it the way he might say that it was going to rain, as information that seemed relevant and that he thought she should have. Willa thanked him and finished taking down the washing and went inside and folded it on the kitchen table and did not allow her hands to hurry. She had known this was coming. Not the specific words, not Mrs. Greaves in particular, but the shape of it. The town deciding what she was before she had the chance to show them. She had seen it happen to other women. She had seen a widow in Calhoun County lose her credit at the feed store within 6 months of her husband's death. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because the town had reclassified her, moved her from one column to another, and credit was something the first column had and the second column did not. Willa had watched that woman manage. She had watched her negotiate and endure and eventually leave, and she had thought at the time that it was deeply unfair, and she had been right. And now she was in the same column, and the unfairness felt exactly as she had expected it would. Not like a blow, but like a door that has been quietly locked while you were looking the other way. The offer from Ordell came on a Thursday. His full name was Gerald Ordell, and he was a land speculator from somewhere east who had acquired 3 parcels in the valley and was in the process of acquiring a 4th. He was not a large man, but he had the quality of taking up more space than his size accounted for, which Willa distrusted on instinct. He came to Mrs. Alcott's in the late afternoon and asked to speak with her in the front room, and Mrs. Alcott allowed it because Ordell had money and because she was not a woman who asked many questions of men with money. He told Willa he was looking for someone to keep house at the property on the south parcel, which he was developing as a working farm. The pay he named was low. The terms were that she would live on the property and be available for whatever the running of it required, a phrase he did not elaborate on, and she noted that he did not elaborate on it. She said she would think about it. He said there was not a great deal of time to think, that he had other candidates. She said she understood and showed him to the door, and he left, and she stood in the front room for a moment with her hand on the doorframe. She did not tell anyone about Ordell's offer that evening. She sat at supper and ate and listened to the mill workers talk about the early ice on the creek and watched Mrs. Alcott move between the kitchen and the table and did not look toward the far end where Daniel sat with his customary quietness. She was doing what she had always done when something difficult required thought. She was holding it at a slight distance and turning it slowly, the way you turn a thing near a fire to warm it evenly. The offer was bad. She knew it was bad. The terms were the terms of a man who believed she had no other options and was pricing accordingly. But the $11.40 had become $9 and some cents, and the East Road washing was not enough, and she had not found other work, and winter was arriving without asking her permission. Percy was at the table that evening because he sometimes ate with the boarders when Mrs. Alcott had extra and felt generous, which was not often, but was more often than Willa had expected of her. He sat beside Willa and ate his supper with the focused attention of a boy who had not always been sure of his next meal. And partway through he said, to no one in particular, that he hoped nobody was going to make Miss Willa leave because she was the only one who ever checked that the lamp in the upstairs hall had enough oil in it, and he didn't like walking up in the dark. He said this, and then went back to eating as though he had noted a fact about the weather. The mill workers said nothing. The schoolteacher looked up from her book briefly and then back down. Mrs. Alcott made the short sound she made when something happened that she had not arranged. Willa did not look at Daniel, but she was aware, in the way that you are aware of a candle in a room, not by looking at it but by the quality of the light it puts into the air, that something shifted at the far end of the table. Not visibly, not with any sound. The way a man who has been still becomes more still when he is attending to something. That was all. She could not have said with certainty that it happened. She only knew that the room felt different for a moment, and then supper continued, and Percy asked for more molasses, and the evening went on. She lay awake that night and thought about the South Parcel and Ordell's unelaborated terms and what it meant to have no good options and to have to choose among the ones you had. She thought about the woman in Calhoun County who had eventually left. She thought about her sister's kitchen and the offer that was not quite an offer. She thought about the farm and the morning the bank's man came, and how she had stood in the yard and decided not to cry, and how that decision had used something up in her, some small reserve of a thing she could not name but could feel the absence of. Some things are too large for naming. Some costs do not show on any ledger. She thought about all of this in the dark, and then she stopped thinking about it and listened to the creek instead, which was still moving beneath the cold, still working its way through the valley, patient and without complaint. The way water is patient, the way water always eventually finds the lower ground. He found her on the back steps on a Friday morning, earlier than usual, before the washing water had come to temperature. She was sitting with her hands around a tin cup that had gone cold, and she was looking at the cottonwoods, which had given up the last of their leaves in the night and stood now in the gray light like something that had made its peace with being bare. She was not crying. She was doing what she did with hard things, holding them at that slight distance and turning them slowly. But the distance was smaller than it had been, and the thing was heavier, and it showed in the set of her shoulders, in the way that posture tells the truth when the face has decided not to. Daniel came out for the pump and saw her and did not pretend he had not. He filled his water can, and then he stood for a moment, and then he sat down on the step below hers, not close, not far, and looked at the cottonwoods with her. He did not ask what was wrong. She did not offer it. They sat in the cold for a time that was longer than it would have been uncomfortable to sit, and it was not uncomfortable. A bird moved through the bare branches of the nearest cottonwood and was gone. The creek said what it always said, which was the same thing it said in every season, patient and without variation. After a while, Daniel set his water can down on the step beside him and said, without looking at her, that he had heard Ordell was putting offers to people who did not have much room to refuse them. He said it quietly and without heat, as a fact he was acknowledging rather than a question he was asking. Willa said that she had spoken with him, yes. Daniel said that the South Parcel was poor land, and that Ordell knew it, and that the terms he offered were terms built on someone else having no choice. She said she was aware of that. There was a pause. He said he thought she was. What he said next he said slowly, and in the particular way of a man who has worked out what he means to say, and is saying it plainly, because plainness is the only kind of honesty he knows. He said that the lease on the north pasture included the ranch house, and that the ranch house had more room than he was using, and more work than one person could manage well before winter set in proper. He said he needed someone to keep the place while he was out on the fence line and the pasture. Cooking, he said, and keeping the stores in order, and making sure the lamp oil did not run out, which he said with the slightest movement at the corner of his mouth. That was the closest thing to lightness he allowed himself. He named a wage. It was fair. It was more than the East Road washing and considerably more than what Ordell had offered, and it had no unelaborated terms attached to it. He said she would have the back room to herself, and that he was gone most of the day, and that the arrangement was work and nothing else unless she decided otherwise, and that he was asking because he needed the help and because he thought she needed the position, and that those two things seemed like a reasonable basis for an agreement. Willa looked at him then. He was looking at the cottonwood still, not at her, giving her the room to think without the weight of being watched. This was, she understood, deliberate. He was not a man who did things by accident. She looked at his profile. The jaw that had not been shaved in a few days, the hat he was holding in both hands between his knees, the way he sat the way a man sits when he is not asking for anything. And she thought about what it meant to be offered something by someone who was not asking for anything in return, and how rare that was, and how it was the rarity of it that made her eyes do something she had not given them permission to do. She did not let it proceed far. She set her cold cup down on the step beside her and said that she accepted, and that she could cook and keep stores and manage a lamp without being reminded, and that she appreciated the offer being made plainly. He said good. He picked up his water can and stood and went back inside, and she sat for another moment in the cold morning air, and then she went in too. She told Mrs. Alcott that afternoon. Mrs. Alcott received the information with the expression of a woman filing it for later use, and said that Willa's room would be available at the end of the week if she was leaving before then. She said it without warmth and without unkindness, which was the full range of what Mrs. Alcott offered. Willa thanked her and went upstairs and repacked her satchel, which did not take long because she had not unpacked very much of herself into that room. She put her Bible on top of everything else and latched the satchel and set it by the door, and felt something in her chest that was not yet happiness but was the room that happiness would eventually occupy. The ranch house north of town was low and solid, built close to the ground in the way of houses that expect hard winters and have prepared accordingly. There was a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen with a good iron stove, 2 back rooms, and a covered porch that ran the length of the south-facing wall and caught what sun there was in the short November days. The stores were adequate and not well organized, which Willa addressed in the first 2 days without being asked. She learned the stove's habits. It ran hot on the left side and needed watching. And she learned where the lamp oil was kept and that there was enough cedar stacked to last 6 weeks if it was used carefully. She cooked supper and left it covered on the stove for when Daniel came in from the fence line, and she ate her own portion at the kitchen table while the fire talked quietly to itself, and the arrangement settled into place the way things settle when they have been put where they belong. The town noticed. Of course it did. Mrs. Greaves had something to say about it, which reached Willa second and third hand, and which she did not respond to. Colbert at the dry goods store was slightly more civil when she came in to add to the ranch's stores, which was not an apology but was as close to one as the town was going to manage. The milliner said she might have work in the spring after all. Percy came out to the ranch on a Saturday with a message from Mrs. Alcott about a forgotten item of Willa's, and stayed for 2 hours and ate 3 biscuits and helped stack wood, and said on his way out that it was a good place and that the horse in the corral looked friendly. Willa said the horse was called Amos and that he was friendly to people who were not loud around him. Percy said he could be quiet when he needed to be. She said she believed him. The first hard frost came on a Tuesday night, and by Wednesday morning the valley was white and still, and the creek ran dark between pale banks, and the pines on the ridge held the cold in their branches and released it slowly in the windless air. Willa stood on the south porch with her shawl around her and looked at all of it and felt the particular quality of a morning that is cold and beautiful and that asks nothing of you except that you be present for it. Daniel came out behind her and stood at the other end of the porch and looked at the same morning she was looking at. He said it was a good frost, that the ground would be solid by afternoon and the fence work would go quickly in solid ground. She said that was good. He said yes, and they stood there in the cold, clear morning for a while longer, not close and not far, looking out at the white valley and the dark water and the pines, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the kind that 2 people only arrive at after they have already understood something about each other that does not need to be said. The fire burned through that first winter, and the next, and the one after that, and the lease on the north pasture was extended and then made permanent, and the arrangement that had begun as work became the kind of thing that has no proper name because it is larger than the names available for it. The town adjusted its opinion the way towns do, slowly, without announcement, without apology. And eventually, Mrs. Greaves said something civil to Willa outside the dry goods store, and it was accepted the way it was offered, which was briefly and without ceremony. Percy grew 4 inches by spring and kept coming out on Saturdays, and eventually stopped needing a reason. The horse Amos lived to be very old. And Willa Crane, who had arrived in Harrow Creek on a Thursday, with a satchel and $9, and the posture of a woman who has decided not to let anyone see her buckle, stayed, and was still there, and was home. The creek kept moving. The pines on the ridge kept the cold in their branches and released it slowly. The fire in the ranch house burned on its low and patient way, the left side running hotter than the right, the way it always had. The frost came and went and came again. The corral stood in the early morning quiet with Amos shifting his weight inside it, breathing clouds into the cold air. The lamp in the window burned through the dark evenings, visible from the road, the way a lamp in a window is visible, which is to say for a long distance and without effort, so that anyone coming through the valley in the cold knew where the warmth was and that it was still there. And that was the story of Willa Crane and Daniel Holt, a woman who arrived with nothing but a satchel and a spine and a habit of standing and deciding, and a man who fixed things without asking to be thanked for it, and a Thursday in October when neither of them knew yet what the other would come to mean, and a Friday morning on the back steps when one of them said plainly what needed to be said and the other one accepted it in kind, and all the quiet days that followed, which were not dramatic and were not small, and which were, in the end, everything that actually mattered. Let me know in the comments how this one felt. I hope it found you well. See you in the next one.